If you could pick for Nick Caserio, Seth, to have an A-plus offseason in either the draft or in free agency, which would it be? Which would you choose for if he can only knock the ball out of the park in one, the draft or in free agency?
If you had to like trade all, if you were a way to trade dollars for picks or something to where all you had was draft picks, or if you could trade all those draft picks for cap space, then
just which one does he do the best? You know, like he's going to do both. He's going to draft players and he's going to sign players.
Yeah, but I like the
agency.
fantasy of only doing one.
Okay,
like if you could only do one, I would say the draft. 100%.
You would?
Like if you're gonna knock it out of the park, yeah. Like if you're gonna knock it out of the park, in the draft, then that means you've got awesome players on cost-controlled contracts for 3 or 4 years. If you knock it out of the park in free agency, it's almost impossible to do it without still spending a good chunk of money and making it more difficult to operate. Like knocking it out in the park in the draft is always the more desirable. It's the difference between eating right and getting plenty of sleep versus drinking really strong coffee.
Yeah. I guess
the draft is coffee. This is like, all right, I don't feel awesome, but like, all right, can I spend some money and get some help from the outside to get me better?
I said free agency on the podcast, and I think it's probably the instant gratification element for me that I feel like, hey, this team is much closer to a Super Bowl now than we thought they would be going into 2024, than we thought they'd be a year ago or even 6-8 months ago. If you knock it out of the park in free agency, I think you're going to be better sooner. They've got a lot of money to spend. That's the other thing. Like them knocking it out of the park in free agency is different than a team like, say, the Ravens, who have $7 million in cap space, knocking it out of the park in free agency. Like you knock it out of the park and you got $60-70 million to spend. It means you've probably done some Dior store shopping in that.
I guess, and you know this. I mean, you as well as anybody that cap space isn't as big as it seems like it is. So knocking it out of the park and for the Texans, who have 30 free agents, many of whom, 10 of whom were starters for at least half the season. It's a lot of replacing, so it turns into, all right, which one of these guys on one-year deals can be replaced for somebody who's better on a one-year deal? Yeah. Or is it just simply a matter of re-signing these guys? That's where I get a little bit. Maybe that's where I am. I'm answering more like, okay, what's more achievable? Is it achievable for the Texans to knock it out of the park in free agency, or is it achievable for them to knock it out of the park in the draft? They don't have the same draft picks that they had in previous years.
That's the other thing.
You don't have a second and eventually a third, number 3 overall pick,
right?
To draft guys that become rookie of the year.
That was that was part of my evaluation too, Seth. Is that if it were last year, I'd say, oh, my God, the draft. I mean, you've got the 2nd and the 12th picks. You've got to knock it out of the park in the draft. They're a better football team now with a ton of cap space, and their draft capital, while they've got the right amount of picks, it's just not as good as in recent years. So that's my feeling on it.
I get the whole thing about free agency versus the draft is, the instant gratification of free agency is nice, but I think you got to have respect for the fact that instant gratification, it's usually an instant gratification that lasts until September.
Yeah.
Because free agency signings, the majority of free agent signings are disappointments.
Yeah.
And the ones that you get most excited about tend to be the biggest disappointments.
Yep.
The majority of guys who sign 5-year contracts are gone before year 3 of their deal. Like it's just, or before they complete year 3 of their deal. It's astounding how bad the success rate is in free agency, but it's just so easy to get excited about because it's a big name. It's lots of bling in April. Right. And then it evaporates in September.
Agree with everything you're saying. Under this scenario, you're guaranteed an A+ in all those free agency signings. You know what I mean? Like I'm telling you, you got them all right.
Well, No, because last year, Nick Cassera did a great job in free agency by my estimation last year, and people hated it. People despised it. People thought it was the dumbest thing ever. What are you doing? You're only signing these guys on 1 and 2 year contracts. Where Sheldon Rankins ended up being a really good signing. Devin Singletary ended up being a really good signing.
Oh, yeah.
And those aren't earth-shattering signings or anything. I mean, Dalton Schultz ends up being a great signing. I would love a tight end who's better than Dalton Schultz, but still retain Dalton Schultz on this roster.
Sure.
So, that's where I just don't. I've got a natural distrust of the free agency market.
No, I do too. But if you're telling me like I can get an A+ in it, and because I think back to Cincinnati a few years ago, when they made the Super Bowl, and Joe Burrow's in his second year. They got some young pieces. Like the Texans, a really good quarterback in his second year with a lot of nice pieces. They crushed it in free agency. They got DJ Reader and Trey Hendrickson and Mike Hilton and some pieces on offense. Like they destroyed, and they end up going to the Super Bowl. I think that's if your answer is A+ in free agency, like if that's what you would prefer, then your example is the Bengals that made the Super Bowl in 2021. I agree wholeheartedly with your premise that. It feels like this is your premise, that you just build a healthier franchise if you get an A+ in the draft every year.
I'll tell you what, yeah. And like most of the really good teams in the league don't spend that much on free agency as a rule.
Yeah.
I think that one of our listeners brought up yesterday that the prime example in Texans history was in 2011 when instead of chasing Ndamukong Suh, was it 2010 or 2011? That was 2011. Right.
Into the Texans you're talking about?
Yeah.
You're talking about Nnamdi Asomugha.
Yeah. Nnamdi Asomugha.
Yeah.
And
it was 2011, by the way.
Ndamukong Suh, not Texans worthy.
No.
Nnamdi Asomugha was not Texans worthy either. He was the big name. And if the Texans were going to be a serious franchise, then you go out and get Nnamdi Asomugha because that's a serious football move. Nnamdi Asomugha ends up sucking. After free agency.
For the Eagles,
And meanwhile, the Texans, it was a dumb signing by the Eagles, too, because Nnamdi Asomugha just didn't fit what they did.
Yeah.
But the Texans get Jonathan Joseph and Danielle Manning for the same price.
Yeah.
And those guys ended up being very, very, very good for a very good defense.
Yes.
So that's knocking it out of the park in free agency. And look, that was one that people were disappointed about at first. Like, you're bringing in this old man, Wade Phillips. Who the hell's Jonathan Joseph? The Bengals suck.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to remember back. Were they disappointed? Was there disappointment in Wade Phillips being the DC?
I don't know. Probably there's.
There's always a faction that's disappointed in everything. I get that.
There's always skepticism about. At that point, people were upset because they felt like Gary Kubiak needed to be fired.
That's right.
That was a year that people kind of felt like the honeymoon period was way over and that Gary Kubiak and Rick Smith needed to be gone. And like Rick Smith, to his credit, pulled off a coup in getting those two guys in free agency. And then also, I think, just finally saying, look, all right, enough's enough. We need an actual defensive coordinator in here. So I don't know about – I felt like my read on the time and my memory of it, now it's been 12 years, 13 years since then, is that a lot of Texans fans were at that moment where they weren't really happy with the fact that it seemed like the owner was making the decision to hire Wade Phillips and that they were kind of just propping up Gary Kubiak, who a lot of Texans fans wanted gone completely.
Yeah.
So it felt like they were just kind of putting gum on the hole in the dam.
Yeah.
And more so than actually fixing things. And they ended up being great moves. So that's my memory of it. Please listeners tell me if you remember it differently.
Yeah.
Because obviously it's dicey when you start trying to gauge the opinion of a fan base.
For sure. Well, especially on something that happened 13 years ago. Text message, a lot of people agreeing with you that the draft, always the draft. Young talent means being good for a long, long time.
Yeah, and I guess I must have flipped my words earlier. The analogy I was trying to use was that the draft is like eating right and exercising, whereas the free agency is coffee.
Or
cocaine.
Yeah. The draft
John's a cokehead is what I've basically decided.
Yes,
he wants to win through free agency. He likes PEDs, he likes cocaine, and he likes fast cars.
I feel like life-wise, the Texans are in a position where cocaine might be the best thing for them to win a Super Bowl.
Yeah.
The cocaine of free agency. Yeah. Pump that fist, Ben. Yeah. Ben's fired up. I got Ben,
What?
noted cokehead, fired up in there. I'm just kidding.